A severance check was still folded inside Graham Alderson's coat pocket when he stepped through the front door of his daughter's elementary school 20 minutes before dismissal, something he had not done in over 4 years. The secretary behind the counter looked up, confused, because in all the years Wren Alderson had attended Birchwood Elementary in East Hamilton, her father had never once arrived early. Had always been the last parent in the pickup line, sometimes not even making it before the after-school program closed. But today, Graham stood quietly near the entrance, holding a brown paper bag with a peanut butter sandwich inside, because he remembered Wren once mentioned she was always hungry by 3 o'clock and nobody ever brought her a snack. When the bell rang and Wren walked out of her classroom dragging her oversized backpack across the floor, she stopped completely. She stared at her father standing near the doors in his work boots and paint-stained jacket, and for a moment her face held an expression no 7-year-old should ever carry. Disbelief that her own father had come for her. Graham Alderson had spent 11 years working as a maintenance systems technician at Corvain Industrial, a privately owned manufacturing firm that operated 3 plants across southern Ontario. His official title never matched the scope of what he actually did. On paper, he maintained heating, ventilation and electrical systems. In practice he was the person every supervisor called when something critical broke down in the middle of a production cycle and nobody else could figure out why. He had once repaired a failing hydraulic press at 2 in the morning during a winter storm, saving the company from losing a contract worth nearly $600,000. His manager thanked him the next day with a coffee from the vending machine, and told him to submit the overtime through the usual form. Graham never complained. Complaining required energy, and every piece of energy he had left after his wife Maren died belonged to Wren. Maren had passed from a pulmonary embolism 3 years earlier. There had been no warning. She woke up one Saturday morning saying her chest felt tight, sat down on the edge of the bed, and never stood again. The paramedics arrived within 9 minutes, but it made no difference. Graham was in the kitchen, making scrambled eggs for Wren when he heard the sound of Maren's body hitting the floor. That sound never left him. Some nights he still heard it in the hallway, a dull, final collapse, and he would lie awake staring at the ceiling, knowing sleep was not coming back. After Maren died, Graham tried to do everything she had done while still doing everything he had always done. He learned to braid hair using videos on his phone at 5:30 in the morning. He learned which groceries to buy, how to sort laundry properly, which shoes Wren needed for gym days versus regular days, and how to pack lunches that a 4-year-old, then a 5-year-old, then a 6-year-old would actually eat. He kept a handwritten schedule taped inside the kitchen cabinet because his phone was always dying, and every night he crossed off the day and stared at the next one like a man reading a sentence he could not escape. His mornings began at 5, breakfast for Wren by 6:15, drop off at school by 8, arrive at the plant by 8:30, work until 5 or later depending on what broke, rush to the after-school program before it closed at 5:45, drive home, heat dinner, help with homework, bathe Wren, read her a story, though most nights he fell asleep before she did, slumped sideways in the small chair beside her bed still holding the book. For a while he convinced himself this was sustainable, that if he just kept moving forward without stopping, eventually things would level out. But things did not level out, they compounded. The car needed a transmission repair he could not afford. The apartment building raised rent by $90 a month with 30 days notice. The daycare Wren had attended before she started grade 1 still sent collection notices for an unpaid balance from 18 months earlier, and every time Graham asked his supervisor about the possibility of shifting to a daytime-only schedule or reducing his on-call obligations, the answer was the same polite refusal dressed up as company policy. Operational needs, staffing limitations, everyone has to carry their share. The breaking point arrived on a Thursday evening in late October. Graham had been called into an emergency repair at 4:20 when a cooling unit failed in the west wing of Plant 2. His supervisor told him it had to be fixed before the overnight shift started at 10. Graham called the after-school program and told them he would be late. A coordinator, a patient woman named Janet who had bent the rules for him more times than she should have, told him they closed at 5:45 sharp and could not make exceptions anymore, because the school board had issued new policies. Graham said he understood and hung up. He worked as fast as he could, sweat running down his neck in the cold mechanical room, hands cramping around wrenches and connectors. He finished the repair by 5:20 and drove 16 kilometers across the city in rush-hour traffic. He arrived at 5:53. The lights in the after-school room were already off. Janet was standing near the entrance in her coat, holding Wren's hand. The little girl was wearing her backpack and clutching a crayon drawing against her chest. Her eyes were red. Janet looked at Graham with the kind of expression that sits somewhere between sympathy and exhaustion, the face of a person who has watched the same tragedy repeat too many times to stay angry about it. On the drive home, Wren did not speak for the first 8 minutes. Then, in a voice so small Graham almost missed it beneath the sound of the heater rattling, she said something that folded his entire life in half. "Ah," she said, "Daddy, am I the reason you're always tired?" Graham pulled the car over on a residential street he did not recognize. He sat there for a long time with his hands on the steering wheel, staring at the red taillights of the car ahead of him, unable to respond because the answer was so far from what she believed, and yet he could not find a single word to explain it. Finally, he turned around in his seat, looked at his daughter's face in the dim glow of a streetlight, and told her she was the only reason he was not tired. She was the reason he kept getting up every morning. Wren nodded slowly, the way children do when they are choosing to believe something because they need it to be true. At night, after Wren fell asleep on the couch with her head on a cushion and her shoes still on, Graham sat at the kitchen table and wrote his resignation letter on the back of a hydrobill envelope. 2 sentences. No explanation, no negotiation, no request for a meeting. He signed it, put it in his coat pocket, and submitted it the next morning before his shift started. His supervisor read it and shrugged. Human Resources processed it by noon. 11 years, and the entire departure took less time than a lunch break. Nobody from management called. Nobody asked why. The plant kept running the same way it always had, as though Graham Alderson had never been inside it at all. For the first 2 weeks Graham felt something he had forgotten existed: stillness. He walked Wren to school in the morning and picked her up at 3. They went to the library on Tuesdays, because Wren had discovered a series about a girl detective who solved mysteries involving stolen animals. They ate grilled cheese sandwiches at a diner on Barton Street, where the owner gave Wren free apple juice, because she always said thank you without being reminded. Graham took small repair jobs through word of mouth, fixing furnaces and leaking pipes for people in the neighborhood who paid him in cash and sometimes in food. It was not enough money. He knew that, but for the first time since Maren died, he was present inside his own life, instead of watching it pass by through a windshield at 60 kilometers an hour. Wren changed almost immediately. She started sleeping through the night again. She stopped biting her fingernails. She drew a picture at school of her family, a tall man with brown hair and a small girl holding his hand, and her teacher pinned it to the hallway bulletin board. Graham saw it during a parent night. He stood in front of it for so long that another parent asked if he was all right. He was. For the first time in years he genuinely was. But money does not care about peace. By the end of the 3rd week, Graham's savings had dropped below $800. Rent was due in 11 days. The electric bill was past due. Needed a winter coat because last year's sleeves stopped 3 inches above her wrists, and Graham had been meaning to buy one since September but kept pushing it off because there was always something more urgent. One afternoon, he quietly drove to a pawn shop on King Street East and sold Maren's engagement ring for $240. The man behind the counter barely looked at it before offering the price. Graham accepted without negotiating, because he did not have the strength to argue over the value of something that had once meant everything. He told himself Maren would have understood. He told himself she would have done the same thing. But when he sat in the car afterward, he pressed his forehead against the steering wheel and stayed there until his breathing returned to normal. Meanwhile, 30 kilometers west in his glass-walled office overlooking Burlington Bay, Priya Sandhu was managing the single largest crisis of her career. Priya had been appointed CEO of Corvain Industrial 18 months earlier, the youngest chief executive in the company's 40-year history, and the first woman to hold the position. She had an engineering degree from the University of Waterloo, an MBA from Queen's, and a reputation for operational precision that bordered on ruthlessness. Under her leadership, the company had landed a federal infrastructure contract worth $42 million, their biggest project ever. She worked 14-hour days, maintained a professional distance from every employee beneath the vice presidential level, and made decisions with a speed that impressed the board and unsettled everyone else. Priya did not know Graham Alderson's name. She had never met him. A company of over 600 employees spread across 3 facilities, a maintenance technician who worked quietly and never escalated complaints simply did not register on her radar. When his resignation was processed, it appeared as one line item in a weekly HR digest she never read. But 3 weeks after Graham left, the consequences arrived. Corvain had been preparing for a critical demonstration of a new modular water treatment system designed for remote Indigenous communities in northern Ontario. The project was the centerpiece of the federal contract and had been personally championed by Priya to the Minister of Infrastructure during a meeting in Ottawa. A successful demonstration would secure the next phase of funding, worth nearly $14 million, and position Corvain as a national leader in sustainable engineering. 2 days before the scheduled demonstration, the primary filtration array failed during a routine stress test. Water pressure readings fluctuated wildly. Sensor calibrations drifted outside acceptable parameters. The backup system, which should have activated automatically, did not respond at all. Engineers spent the entire night running diagnostics. By morning they had identified the symptoms but could not locate the root cause. The lead engineer, a man named Foley who had been with the company for 8 years, told Priya honestly that the system architecture had been built around a series of custom modifications made by a previous technician whose documentation was incomplete. Without that technician's knowledge of the underlying logic, they were essentially guessing. Priya asked who the technician was. Foley checked the records and told her the name, Graham Alderson, resigned. No forwarding information. No exit interview. Priya spent the next 48 hours refusing to accept the situation. She brought in 2 external engineering consultants at $1,200 per hour each. They examined the system for a full day and concluded that whoever had designed the modifications possessed an intuitive understanding of fluid dynamics and electrical integration that could not be reverse engineered from the hardware alone. One consultant described it as artisan-level work inside an industrial framework, which was his polite way of saying it was brilliant and completely undocumented. The demonstration was postponed. The minister's office called asking for an explanation. The board convened an emergency session and asked Priya how a single technician's departure could threaten a $42 million contract. She had no acceptable answer. On a cold Tuesday evening, Priya drove to the address listed in Graham's personnel file. She had expected a modest neighborhood, perhaps an older subdivision with smaller homes. What she found was a low-rise apartment building, on a narrow street in East Hamilton, where the hallway smelled like heating oil and the elevator had a handwritten out-of-order sign taped across the doors. As she climbed 3 flights of stairs in heels she had not changed out of after a board meeting, knocked on a door with a faded number 7 and waited. Graham opened the door holding a dishcloth. Behind him Wren was sitting on the floor surrounded by library books and a half-finished puzzle of the solar system. The apartment was small. A living room that doubled as a dining room, a narrow kitchen with a window that looked onto a brick wall, and a short hallway leading to what appeared to be 2 small bedrooms. But it was warm. The walls were covered with Wren's drawings, taped up at a child's height in colorful overlapping rows. A small shelf near the door held framed photos, a wedding portrait, a woman laughing in a garden, a baby being held against a shoulder. Priya had rehearsed what she would say during the entire drive. She had prepared a professional pitch, something about consulting fees and project timelines and mutual benefit, but standing in that doorway, looking at the drawings on the walls and the little girl sitting, cross-legged on the carpet carefully fitting a piece of Saturn into its place, every prepared sentence disappeared. Graham recognized the name on the business card she handed him. He invited her in because refusing felt unnecessary. He had nothing to hide and nothing to protect except the evening routine he had finally built with his daughter. Priya explained the situation carefully. The filtration system, the federal contract, the failed demonstration, the consultants who'd not solve it. She spoke precisely, the way she always did, with numbers and timelines and consequences laid out in logical sequence. But halfway through her explanation, she noticed Graham was no longer looking at her. He was watching Wren, who had walked over to the kitchen to pour herself a glass of water, using both hands to steady the heavy pitcher. The girl returned to her puzzle, sat down, and quietly continued working without asking for help. Priya stopped talking. Ram looked at her and said, simply, that he had given 11 years to Corvain and received nothing in return except exhaustion and the slow erosion of his relationship with his daughter. He was not angry. His voice carried no bitterness which somehow made it worse. He said he was sorry about the contract and he hoped they would find someone to fix the system, but he was not going back. Priya nodded. She thanked him for his time. She stood, picked up her coat and moved toward the door. Then Wren looked up from her puzzle and said, "Are you my dad's friend from work?" Priya froze. She looked down at the little girl with Saturn in her hand and felt something tighten across her chest that she did not have a name for. She said yes, she supposed she was. Wren smiled. "That's nice. Dad doesn't have many friends." Graham walked Priya to the door without speaking. She drove home to her condominium in Burlington and sat in the dark for 40 minutes without turning on a single light. Over the next 2 weeks, things at Corvain deteriorated further. A second demonstration attempt produced inconsistent results. The minister's office issued a formal warning that the contract could be reassigned. Board members began privately discussing whether Priya was the right leader for the company. She worked later and later, sometimes not leaving her office until midnight, eating takeout from containers stacked beside her laptop while reviewing engineering schematics she only partially understood. Meanwhile, through a coincidence that felt too deliberate to be accidental, Priya began seeing Graham in small moments across the city. She spotted him one Saturday morning at a community center on Cannon Street where he was volunteering to repair donated appliances for a winter clothing drive. Another time, she saw him outside a hardware store on Ottawa Street, carrying lumber to his truck, while Ren sat in the passenger seat reading a book with her feet on the dashboard. Once, she passed him on the sidewalk near Jackson Square. He was holding Ren's hand, and they were arguing playfully about whether hot chocolate was better with marshmallows or whipped cream. Ren was laughing. Each time, Priya watched from a distance and felt the same unfamiliar tightness. She had built her entire career on the belief that success required sacrifice, that personal attachment was a vulnerability, that being needed by a company was the same as being valued. Her father, a first-generation immigrant who had worked 16-hour days running a printing business in Brampton until his heart gave out at 59, had taught her that rest was earned through achievement and that achievement had no ceiling. She had followed that philosophy without question for 20 years, had made her wealthy, respected and profoundly alone. She had no children, no partner. Her last relationship had ended 3 years earlier when the other person told her she treated intimacy like a quarterly review, something to be scheduled, evaluated and optimized. She had not argued because she knew it was true. 3 weeks after her first visit, Priya returned to Graham's apartment. This time she did not bring a business card or a prepared speech. She brought a bag of groceries, milk, bread, cheddar cheese, apples, and a box of the granola bars she had noticed in his cupboard during her first visit that had a reduced for quick sale sticker on them. She told herself it was a professional gesture, a goodwill offering before making another request. She told herself she was being strategic, but when Graham opened the door and she saw the surprise on his face, she realized she had not come to negotiate. She had come because this apartment, with its crayon drawings and library books and half-finished puzzles, was the warmest place she had been in years. Graham accepted the groceries without making it awkward. He invited her in. Ren immediately pulled her into the living room to show her a book about ocean animals she had borrowed from the library. Priya sat on the floor beside a 7-year-old girl and listened to a detailed explanation of why the blue whale's heart was the size of a small car, and for 20 minutes she did not think about Corvain or the contract or the board or her career. She started visiting once or twice a week. Sometimes she brought technical questions about the water treatment system, genuine questions that Graham answered patiently while sketching diagrams on scrap paper at the kitchen table. Other times she came with no reason at all. She helped Ren with a school project about Canadian provinces. She learned that Graham made excellent soup from whatever was in the fridge, and that Ren had a habit of narrating her thoughts aloud, while drawing, a running commentary that included opinions about weather, animals, her classmates, and whether the moon was actually following their car when they drove at night. Graham was cautious. He did not ask Priya why she kept coming, did not assume anything beyond the surface of each visit, but he noticed things. He noticed that she always sat in the same chair near the window. He noticed that she relaxed more each time she arrived, her shoulders dropping incrementally, her voice losing its corporate cadence until she sounded like a person instead of a position. He noticed that she laughed differently around Ren, freely, without self-consciousness, as though the little girl had unlocked a door Priya had forgotten it existed. One evening in late November, a freezing rain turned the city into glass. Priya had stayed later than usual helping Ren glue cotton balls onto a school art project while Graham fixed a leaking faucet in the bathroom. When she finally stood to leave, the streets were coated in ice, and the city had issued a travel advisory. Now Graham told her she should wait until the salt trucks came through. Ren, already in pajamas, said she could sleep in her bed and Ren would take the couch because that was what Ren's mom used to do when guests visited. The room went quiet. Priya sat back down, Graham made tea. Ren fell asleep on the couch with her head on Priya's lap, which neither of them acknowledged directly, but which changed something between them permanently. After Ren was asleep, Priya told Graham something she had never said to anyone. She told him she was afraid, not of failing professionally. She had contingency plans for every business scenario. She was afraid that she had optimized her entire life for outcomes that did not matter. She had a penthouse with a lake view, a car that cost more than his annual salary, a wardrobe curated by a personal shopper, and she could not remember the last time someone was happy to see her walk through a door. Every relationship in her life was transactional. Every interaction had an agenda. She did not know how to exist without one. Graham listened without interrupting. He was good at that. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that set itself so deeply into her thinking she would repeat it to herself for years afterward. He said, "The people who matter most don't show up because you're useful. They show up because you're there." Priya left the next morning before Ren woke up, but she sat in her car for a long time before starting the engine, watching the ice melt slowly from the windshield as the defroster hummed. 2 weeks before Christmas, the board gave Priya a final deadline. Deliver a successful demonstration by January 15 or the federal contract would be lost. Investors were already positioning to withdraw. 2 board members had privately called for her resignation. The pressure was absolute and mechanical, the kind that leaves no room for anything except response. Priya did not call Graham. She did not visit his apartment. She did not send a message or make a request. Instead, she did something that shocked every person in the boardroom. She stood in front of the full executive team, the board of directors, and 2 representatives from the federal minister's office, and delivered a 20-minute presentation that had nothing to do with engineering. She talked about Graham Alderson without using his name. She described an employee who had given 11 years of exceptional work to the company and received no recognition, no advancement, no flexibility, and no support when his wife died and he became a sole parent. She described a man who was so essential to the company's most important project that his departure nearly collapsed a $42 million contract, yet whose name had never appeared in a single performance review, leadership meeting, or succession plan. She described a system that treats skilled workers as interchangeable parts, and then acted surprised when the machine stopped functioning after the most critical part was removed. Then she presented a proposal, a complete restructuring of Corvain's employee support framework, flexible scheduling for parents and caregivers, child care subsidies, mental health benefits, a technical career track that allowed skilled tradespeople to advance without moving into management, profit sharing for employees below the director level, and a formal policy stating that no employee would ever be penalized for prioritizing family obligations during non-critical hours. The board was silent. One member asked how much it would cost. Priya told him it would cost significantly less than losing the federal contract, which was the truth, but not the reason she was proposing it. The board approved the framework provisionally, pending the successful resolution of the demonstration. That evening, Priya drove to Graham's apartment for the last time with a professional purpose. The streets were dark and cold. All Christmas lights flickered from balconies and window frames across the neighborhood, including a single strand of colored bulbs that Ren had taped to the inside of their living room window, using what appeared to be an entire roll of masking tape. When Graham opened the door, Priya was holding a folder. Inside was not a contract, it was a letter, handwritten on plain paper, not company letterhead. In it, she described every change she had proposed to the board. She described the flexible schedule that would allow him to drop Ren off and pick her up every day. She described the childcare support, the profit sharing, the technical leadership role that would give him authority over the systems he had built. She described the promise she had made to the entire company, that no worker would be treated as disposable again. At the bottom of the letter, in handwriting that was less steady than the rest, she wrote a single line that was not about Corvain at all. She wrote, "I built a company that runs on systems, but I never understood what holds people together until I sat on your floor and watched your daughter teach me the planets." Graham read the letter twice. He looked at Priya standing in his doorway with her coat dusted in snow, and he saw something behind her carefully constructed composure. A loneliness so familiar it almost looked like his own. He did not answer immediately. He's asked her to come inside. He made tea. Ren appeared from the hallway in her pajamas, saw Priya, and immediately climbed onto the couch beside her as though this had been the plan all along. The 3 of them sat in the small living room while snow fell silently outside the window, and the colored lights reflected against the glass. Eventually, Graham said he would come back, but not for the contract, not for the company. He would come back because he believed her, because the letter was not a negotiation, it was a promise made by a person who had finally learned what promises were supposed to mean. Priya nodded. Then, without planning to, without rehearsing, without any strategic calculation at all, she said something that surprised both of them. I'm not asking you to come back to Corvain, Graham, I'm asking you to let me come back here. The silence between them held everything: grief, exhaustion, loneliness, and something new that neither of them was ready to name but both recognized. Wren, half asleep between them on the couch, murmured, "You can come back whenever you want, just bring the apples again." Graham returned to Corvain in the first week of January. He repaired the filtration system in 4 days. The demonstration proceeded without a single fault. The federal contract was secured. The minister's office issued a public statement praising Corvain's engineering innovation and commitment to sustainable infrastructure for northern communities. But the real changes happened quietly. Flexible schedules were implemented across all 3 plants. Not 12 employees who had been on the verge of resigning chose to stay. A single mother working in quality assurance told her supervisor, in tears, that the childcare subsidy meant she could stop leaving her son with a neighbor she did not fully trust. A widowed machinist in Plant 3 requested a shift change so he could attend his daughter's Thursday afternoon soccer games and was approved the same day without a single form. Productivity across the company increased by 11% in the first quarter, which the board attributed to operational improvements, but which every employee on the floor knew was simply the result of people no longer being afraid. Graham was given the title of Senior Technical Lead, a position created specifically for him, with hours that allowed him to be at Birchwood Elementary every afternoon by 3. He never missed pickup again, and Priya changed in ways the board could measure and ways they could not. She began holding monthly open sessions where employees at every level could raise concerns directly. She learned the names of people she had previously walked past without seeing. She ate lunch in the cafeteria instead of her office, not every day, but often enough that people stopped being surprised by it. Afternoon, a junior technician asked her a question about compressor ratings, and she admitted she did not know the answer. It was the first time anyone at Corvain had heard a CEO say those words. The technician later told his colleagues it was the most respected he had ever felt. Graham and Priya did not rush into anything. They did not perform grand gestures or make declarations. What grew between them was slow and deliberate, built in small accumulated moments. Shared dinners at the kitchen table, walks through Gage Park while Wren ran ahead collecting leaves, Saturday mornings reading the paper in Graham's living room while Wren drew pictures on the floor between them. They were 2 people who had been carrying weight alone for so long that the simple act of sitting in the same room without needing anything from each other felt like the most radical thing either had experienced. Wren adapted with the startling ease that children sometimes possess when they recognize safety. She began leaving a second placemat on the table without being asked. She showed Priya her school reports with the same seriousness she reserved for important news. One evening she asked Priya if she had ever lost someone she loved. Priya said yes. Wren nodded and said, "It's okay, you can share ours." Neither Graham nor Priya responded, neither needed to. Months later, on a warm evening in late June, the company held a celebration for the successful completion of Phase 1 of the water treatment project. The event was held on the rooftop terrace of the Burlington headquarters, overlooking the bay, where the sun was setting in long amber bands across the water. Employees mingled with municipal officials and federal representatives. Music played from a speaker someone had set up near the railing. Children ran between tables chasing each other while their parents watched and laughed. Graham stood near the edge of the terrace, holding a glass of water because he had never been a drinker, looking out at the city where he had lived his entire life. Hamilton sprawled below him. The old steel mills, the escarpment lined with trees, the neighborhoods where he had repaired furnaces and unclogged drains and built a quiet life from the wreckage of a devastating loss. Priya walked over and stood beside him. Wren was across this terrace showing another child how to fold a paper airplane using a technique she had invented that involved an unconventional number of creases and absolute confidence. They stood together without speaking for a while. The noise of the party continued behind them. The bay reflected the last of the sunlight. Then Graham said quietly, "Marin would have liked you." Priya looked at him. She did not say anything for a moment, and she said, "I think she would have liked what you became." Below them the city lights began turning on one by one as dusk settled into evening, and somewhere across the terrace, Wren laughed loudly at something only she found funny, the kind of full, unself-conscious laughter that only happens when a child feels completely safe. Oh, if this story stayed with you, take a moment to think about the people in your life who show up not because you are useful to them, but simply because you are there. In Canada alone, over 1 million single parents raise children while working full-time, and many of them face the same impossibles Graham faced every day, between earning a living and being present for the people who need them most. Sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is not to keep going, but to stop and finally ask whether the direction they are heading is worth the cost. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment telling us, have you ever had to choose between your career and the people you love? Share this video with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to Integrity Tales for more stories that remind us what truly matters. Because the people who change the world are not always the ones with the loudest voices. Sometimes they are the ones who quietly show up, every single day, and never stop trying.